So my name's Justine Sambrook. I'm curator of the Elwall Photographs Collection here at the RIBA. The Photographs Collection is part of the British Architectural Library, and it contains over 1.5 million photographs showing architecture dating from prehistory to the present day, and on every photographic medium apart from the daguerreotype. So we're still on the lookout for a daguerreotype. I have curated an exhibition on colour in architectural photography, which is in the library at the moment, but I'm going to have a chat to you about some examples of the use of colour in architectural photography from our collection. This is a closer look talk, so it's a chance for you to have a look at the objects yourself. So do feel free while I'm talking to get up and have a wander around and look at the objects that I'm talking about, and also at the end there'll be a chance to have a closer look and to ask any questions that you'd like to ask, but do interrupt me if you've got any questions on the way as well. So I'm going to begin with the light box over here, so if you can't quite see it then do feel free to move around or have a look afterwards. On the left hand side of the light box are some lantern slides from around the middle of the 19th century. Now, experiments with colour photography are almost as old as the medium itself. And throughout the 19th century, prints or glass lantern slides were hand-coloured. So the way that photographers were creating colour in their photography was very artificial. And they were painting on top of the glass slide. Lantern slides were used in a contraption a bit like this, a magic lantern. And they were really kind of an old technique, a predecessor of our slides or even PowerPoints today. And it was a revolutionary new way for people to view photographs, because until then they'd been looking at an individual print or an individual negative. Now a lot of people could look at a much larger scale image and they could all look at it at once. So today we think of colour photography as being really the truer reflection of what we actually see with our eyes. But in those days it was really the opposite, because the colour that was being created was so artificial and so surreal. It's quite fantastical, and certainly the lantern slides on display here are very surreal and very they have a fairy tale quality to them. So moving along, I'm just going to turn these prints over because they're very light sensitive, so we try and minimise their exposure to the light. These are cyanotype. The cyanotype process was invented by Sir John Herschel in 1842, so it's a very early photographic process. And the paper, just ordinary watercolour or cartridge paper, was saturated with iron salts, and then it could be exposed just to natural daylight to create the image. So these would have had a glass plate negative placed on top of the paper and then just exposed to daylight to create the image. And the image could be fixed just using plain water. But as I say, they are very light sensitive, so it's not an ideal technique. They became popular in the sort of mid to late 19th century with amateur photographers, because it was a much cheaper technique than ordinary black and white photography, and it was a good way for them to proof their negatives before committing to the final black and white print, so they could see if the negative was going to be any good. So it was a lot more affordable, it was easy, they could do it at home because they didn't need an enlarger, and it was a quick process as well. These prints are by the photographic firm Bedford Lemaire, and they come from this green portfolio here, which is full of other prints. Bedford Lemaire are most well known for their opulent interiors of English country houses at the time. And these portfolios would have been mass-produced in cyanotype and purchased by architects and craftsmen who wanted to keep up to date with what their contemporaries were producing, and who also wanted to kind of keep an ideas book, keep a selection of different images that they could use as source material for their own work. And because the cyanotype process was a lot cheaper than the ordinary black and white process, it meant that these portfolios were a lot more affordable. And then obviously the cyanotype basically became the blueprint, which was then so commonly used to reproduce architectural drawings, really until today's computer-aided drawing came to the fore. So there's definitely a link to architecture in that way, as well as through the actual photography of the cyanotype. So moving on around the table to the three little colour prints next to the loop there. These are polychromes. The polychrome process was invented in the 1870s by a French photographer, and it basically used multiple duplicates of the same negative to create the colour image. So on each duplicate of the negative, all but one colour would be blocked out, and then the different coloured negatives would be sandwiched back together to create the multicoloured image. And so these images could be made up of up to 12 different negatives sandwiched together. And it's a very effective technique, and if we look at the prints just with the naked eye, it does resemble true colour photography. But I've left the loop there in case anyone wants to have a look. If you just look at it through the magnifier, you can see it doesn't resemble a photograph. It is a much more mechanical technique, and you can really see that when you have a look, particularly the image on the left of the bridge. If you have a look at that through the loop, you can really see. So moving on to the 20th century, the 1930s particularly, the modern movement was coming to the fore. Modernist architecture was best summed up by black and white photography. The images that I've put out there are by the photographers Dell and Wainwright, who were the official photographers to the Architectural Review in the 1930s and 40s. And their photography just sums up modernism perfectly. They're very unusual viewpoints, very stark contrast between light and shadow, very dramatic images. And the unadorned facades and the clean lines of modernism were really flattered by this style of photography. There was an opinion that architects were creating architecture that would look good in these black and white photographs, but perhaps when you saw it in real life, it was a little bit dull, a little bit flat. And the artist Michael Rothenstein wrote in the Architectural Review in 1946, "The modern architect imitates the photographer. He builds with lights and shadows with black and white. The infinitely varied polychromatic possibilities of his medium are neglected. The great majority of modern buildings are conceived in an uninteresting chiaroscuro, an empty scheme of lights and halftones which rely upon the window openings to afford relief." So there was a bit of a backlash against this kind of relationship between the photographer and the architect. And then, conversely, elements of colour that did exist in architecture at the time weren't being fully communicated to the journal reading public. The photographs, the black and white photographs in the middle there of the Unité de Habitation in Marseille by Le Corbusier. The black and white photographs are by the famous French photographer Lucien Hervé, who had a very symbiotic relationship with Le Corbusier. He photographed an awful lot of his buildings and they worked very closely together. And his images were really how the public came to know Le Corbusier's buildings. And so many architects who later visited Marseille to see the building in real life were shocked to see how colourful it was, because it was just being communicated as this really kind of monochrome, grey, concrete slab. And actually, it's interesting to read about Le Corbusier's use of colour in the building, and you can see in this photograph here how brightly coloured it actually is. Interestingly, the opinion has been formed that Corb was using the colour to distract the eye from certain construction defects that he hadn't had any control over in the building of the Unité. Also, it is thought that when he saw the building finally built, the sight of the massive grey concrete was actually a bit of a shock to him, and that he felt that the texture that he'd created with the kind of gravel roughened concrete wasn't sufficient to create enough interest for the eye. So it's really interesting that all this kind of went on in his design, but it wasn't being communicated when people were seeing articles about the building in the press. So during the 30s and 40s, colour photography became a lot easier and it became a lot more popular. In the 1930s, Kodachrome transparency and Kodacolour negative film were invented. And that meant that it was a lot more sophisticated than the techniques that had preceded it. And it meant that photographers began to experiment with the medium a lot more. The journal right at the bottom on the corner there is the Architectural Review from 1932. And it's opened at a page that shows a colour photograph of the new BBC building. And that article was completely shot in colour, and it was the first colour spread in the Architectural Review, so it was kind of a sign of what was to come. But colour photography wasn't that popular with the photographers themselves. The architectural photographer, Eric de Marais, wrote a book in 1968 on colour photography, and he advocated its use for the non-professional, but he was quite sneering about it for the professional photographer, writing that black and white photography remains the more creative medium precisely because it is the more limited and disciplined. Its images are generally stronger in their impact than those of colour photography. Many works in black and white by famous photographers stay sharply in the memory, but how few there are in colour, even when taken by the same masters, of which the same can be said. So it was definitely seen as a weak medium in comparison to black and white. And so, kind of on that note, moving just around the table, the bottom shot there is by John Maltby, who is a renowned black and white architectural photographer. He didn't like the medium of colour, he didn't use it. Apparently he experimented with it. Somebody who worked in his studio told us that he did experiment in the 1930s with colour photography, but it wasn't successful. He didn't like it, and we've got his entire archive, and we don't have any colour photographs in that archive. So the photographs that he took as experiments didn't survive, which kind of show that he didn't think much of them, enough to value them and enough to keep them. This photograph is from 1968, and it's taken for the magazine Modern Woman. So it's likely that when he was using colour later in his career like this, it was because he was being commissioned and because he was under pressure from the magazines or from the publishers to use colour rather than what his personal preference would have been. Similarly, the book and the black and white photograph above that are by Edwin Smith, another kind of master of the black and white medium, who, when we got his archive from his widow, she told us that he loathed colour photography and didn't really use it in his professional work again until the 60s and 70s. These small photographs on the lightbox here, this is quite an exciting new acquisition to the collection from Edwin Smith's son, who just kind of found almost a shoebox of extra images that we hadn't been given and passed them on to us very recently. These are colour shots that he took whilst on holiday in France in 1937, so they're really early. And it's likely that this was kind of right at the beginning of his use of colour, and he was experimenting while on holiday, taking some snaps. Some of them are architectural, some of them are landscapes, some beach scenes. They're not terribly successful, particularly in comparison to the black and white shots that he was taking at the time, which were wonderful. And he certainly felt that because most photographers couldn't afford to have colour processing facilities themselves. They were very expensive and very complex and used a lot of different chemicals. And so they would have to send off their films to other people to process. And he felt that that lack of control was not a good idea for him. He liked to keep control of the processing himself. And so going back to the other two images of the cottage there, the book and the black and white image. The black and white image was taken in 1950. And the image for the cover of the book was taken in 1969, but it's almost the same view. So it seems likely that the publishers of the book sent him back. They said, yeah, we like this black and white shot, but we want it in colour. We want the cover of the book to be colour. So he would probably pushed into it reluctantly. And so the influx of colour had a transformative effect on the reputation of architects as well as photographers. The book, just next to the lightbox there, is a book about the work of the Mexican architect Luis Barragan. And his work was being published in journals such as Arts and Architecture from the 1940s onwards, but it was always shot in black and white. And the thing about Barragan's work is that it's modernist, but it uses elements of colour from the Mexican vernacular. And so for it to be communicated in black and white was very strange. And it wasn't until an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1976 that the colour photographs of his collaborator Armando Salas Portugal were finally shown and proved to be a revelation to many of the viewing public. So do feel free to have a look through that book and have a look at some more of his work, because you'll see that the colour is really the huge kind of identifying element of his work, and for it to have not been shown initially is quite strange to look back on now. So during the 1970s and 80s, there was a real influx of colour, almost an explosion of colour in architectural journals and publications, because publishers and advertisers felt that colour had a more seductive effect on the readership. But also, it was becoming easier to create colour work for photographers, although the medium still did have limitations, and it often had a very slow shutter speed and had to be bracketed, so that you'd have to create several shots to create the one final shot. And this meant that there aren't a lot of people in colour shots at the time, and it's almost going back to the work of Dell and Wainwright and the modernist photography, and for the same reason. The shots are very unpopulated. That's because they didn't want the movement of people blurring the shots. At the same time that colour was really coming to the fore, so was the postmodern movement. It has been suggested that the two had a symbiotic relationship and had an influence on each other. Certainly, postmodern architecture couldn't have been properly communicated without the use of colour photography. And then again, going back to the work of the modernist architects who were accused of looking to create work that would have been communicated well in black and white, the same has been said of the postmodernists. And actually, even before the modern movement, back in the 19th century, the architectural critic Henry Russell Hitchcock had written about the architect William Butterfield that he consciously created buildings that could be perfectly rendered in the builder's woodcuts. So there's an example here, a photograph of one of Butterfield's churches with the woodcut that was shown in the builder at the time. And in a similar way, architects such as James Stirling were accused of creating buildings that would look wonderful in the journal's colour spread. The rise of colour photography also meant the rise of interior photography, so kind of a subgenre of architectural photography. Journals such as House and Gardens in the 1970s really concentrated on interior photography, and the colour meant that these kind of lavish interiors could really be fully communicated. And the photographs were almost promoting the furnishings and the furniture rather than the architecture itself. And so moving up more to the present day and digital photography, I'm going to show you some of our more contemporary work. But this is the work of a photographer called Richard Bryan. He's a wonderful photographer. He's been working from the 1970s kind of right to the present day. And I just wanted to show you this because I think this is quite an interesting point. But I was showing a colleague this photograph the other day, and she said to me, well, where's the colour? She thought it was a black and white photograph, which I think is clearly not a black and white photograph, but I think it's an interesting point that it's not brightly coloured. It's not going back to those early, very surreal, very multicoloured, technicolor shots. Photographers today don't need to do that. They can be more subtle in their use of colour. They can use it to highlight texture. And I think that's quite a contrast, and that colour photography today is more of a reflection of what we see when we look at the architecture, rather than that very fantastical view that was being shown earlier on. And so just to finish off, I'll just show you some of our digital work on the iPad. This is a German photographer called Roland Tauber. And again, when you look at these photographs, if you imagine how difficult it would be to portray this corridor in black and white, it just wouldn't come across at all. It would be a very uninteresting photograph. And I think that photographers today are very lucky in that they have that choice between colour and black and white, and they can use the medium that they feel is most appropriate for the photograph that they're taking. I think this is an interesting example because, I mean, again, the German Pavilion, it's a modernist building. It was built in 1929. These aspects of the building couldn't really have been portrayed very successfully in black and white. So it's interesting to see a contemporary photograph of the building that's perhaps giving a different message, showing the audience something different. This is Paolo Rosselli. And again, this is another kind of unexpectedly colourful aspect of a modernist building. And just to finish off, I don't know if any of you have ever had a look at RIBA Pics, but RIBA Pics is the online image database of the British Architectural Library, and it contains over 70,000 images from across the collections of the library, so the Photographs Collection, the Drawings and Archives Collection, and the Books and Periodicals Collection. It's actually a really great source of information. You should be able to see most of these images on there if you want to have a look when you get home, as well as many others, and there's a lot of information about each image and about the buildings as well. So do have a look, and you can also purchase images through RIBA Pics for publication, for display, or for student work as well. So if anyone's got any questions, do feel free to either ask me now or to ask me while everyone's having a look round. Any questions?
Can anyone use the library?
Anyone can use the library, yes. It's open to the public. You just need photographic ID to access it. And it's open on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Fridays and Saturday mornings. So you can just turn up. But the Photographs Collection, you do need to make an appointment in advance. Thank you.